I report to a board of directors, so I try to have good relationships with them and make sure I understand their direction and making sure we're not going into mission drift and their expectations. Here's a real easy formula for somebody new with a board is say, okay, what are the decisions the board makes on their own? Number two, what are the decisions that I as the CEO can make on my own? And three, what are the decisions we need to make together? And try to force them to get that list out so there's an understanding, so there's not a misstep 4 months later and they say, well, you went and hired this VP of Canada or whatever. All executive levels have to go through the board. You know, if you didn't know, you didn't know.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the CEO Podcast, where we talk with today's CEOs on current issues, problems in the workplace in today's economy. I'm your host, Mario, together with my co-host, Professor Robert Hargrove. We are from Masterful Coaching, and welcome to another episode. Today's guest, Jason Brown, President and CEO of Marketplace Chaplains. Jason, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you guys. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Well, Jason, before we dive into the topic of what is it like to be a CEO of an organization today, just give us a little bit about your background. So early influences, education.
My family were pretty much entrepreneurs, did commercial real estate, went to college, got a marketing degree, then got my master's, worked for large companies like Procter & Gamble, and then, as you know, went on the professional rodeo circuit for 4 years as a pro athlete, made a living and won a world title. And after that, stayed in the industry as sales manager at Wrangler, the apparel company, did a computer resale business. And then after that, 23 years now, got called to come serve and bring all those skills and experiences to this nonprofit we call Marketplace Chaplains. So watching leaders all the time, but sometimes it's more about watching what not to do than what to do. And so learning from other missteps.
Oh, nice. Okay, so Robert and I do a fair amount of executive coaching with CEOs, with C-level executives specifically, with Fortune 500. And one of the things that we encounter is that sometimes executives that we work with have a fear of talking, like a little bit of afraid on how to approach my boss, their boss being the CEO. So how do you handle these things, especially with your executive team? And then my second part is, what advice would you give, let's say, to the first time CEO on how to handle this topic?
Wow. Okay, well, I report to a board of directors, so I try to have good relationships with them and make sure I understand their direction and making sure we're not going into mission drift and their expectations. So I'm their first customer, and then anybody around or under me, those are my customers. So I would say with my C-suite and other executives that I make sure they all know the vision, the mission, our core values, our goals, our strategies, our priorities for this year. And so when anything comes up, you can bounce that off against that objective framework and say, okay, is this really an issue or a problem? Is this going to move the needle forward? Is it something that's good to do or would be cool? And then what is the organizational sensitivity to really get that done? And if we're going to do this, what are we going to stop doing? Because you can't just keep adding things onto the plate in the new initiative every month. So when you set that up, it's easier to say, no, I don't think that's a good idea. Or, let's table that for another time. Remember, we have all these other things going on and we haven't completed those. So let's stay on task on finishing what we started. So to answer your question, if you set it up right, it's okay to not be combative or talking down to someone, but help them to understand, hey, that's a good idea, but remember this, and this. So don't you think it makes more sense to wait, or we'll look at that after we see the results and KPIs from this other project?
Robert, I know you and I had a lot of conversation on this topic. So what would you recommend let's say, a fresh CEO, how to handle situations like this?
I would just say that you have to go to your board and clarify what I call your going in mandate. And what is the job that the board is hiring you to do and not do? What are you empowered to do and not do? I think the relationship of the CEO and the board is inherently, to tell you the truth, a little weird because the CEO wants to, on the one hand, be like a teenager who's totally independent, who can strike out on their own and do what they want. On the other hand, they want to create a collaborative relationship with the board. After all, the board's main job is to hire and fire the CEO. So I think there's a lot of tension in that, let's call it creative tension in that relationship. I'm not sure what percentage of CEOs handle it well or not well. So those are a few thoughts.
Yeah, I talked with a guy one time and we came up with something, especially as a new CEO. And there's Carver models. We have a big board policy manual. There's varying sizes, and even when you have that stuff, there's still sometimes board members are people too, and they have their personal agendas and things.
Right.
Um, so that's always hard to navigate. But here's a real easy formula for somebody new with a board: is say, okay, what are the decisions the board makes on their own?
Hmm.
Number two, what are the decisions that I, as the CEO, can make on my own? And three, what are the decisions we need to make together? And try to force them to get that list out so there's an understanding, so there's not a misstep 4 months later and they say, well, you went and hired this VP of Canada or whatever. And I'm like, well, yeah, we wanted to expand and grow and do all that. And then they say, well, all executive levels have to go through the board. If you didn't know, you didn't know. So trying
Oh,
to
yeah, I think
eliminate,
that's a great formula that you
yeah.
just presented. I find that very helpful. I'm actually working on an article about this now called Clarify Your Going In Mandate with the Board. And those three
Hmm.
suggestions I think, are really excellent.
Yeah. And for me, it was different because I came out of the marketing and I was CMO for 20 years. So going from CMO to CEO, you have a lot more things on your plate: employees, HR, finance, board, policies.
One of the things I say in this ebook I'm working on called Crushing It 10 Hacks for the New CEO's First 365 Days. A hack
Wow.
is like an expert secret. So, one of the things I say in that article is that being a CEO is a job that nothing can prepare you for. Not an MBA, not being a C suite member, not being the head of a giant division of a global 1,000 corporation.
Not even being a CEO in a previous role.
That's true. Yeah.
So, what do you think is the big shift? Maybe you were already on that track, but
I,
say
yeah.
more about this. How do
I,
you make that shift? Most of the people who become CEOs have a pretty big ego. So probably there's a tendency to say, I got this, when maybe they really don't.
Yeah, and that's hard, especially in marketing, because you're always thinking of expansion, growth, kind
Yeah.
of go and move. In CEO, you're more constrained. There's a lot of CEO peer groups, and people say it's lonely at the top. Well, it really is, because until you're sitting in the seat, you don't understand all the competing tensions in your headquarters, in your C suite, on your executive team, the field, the board, market influences. Everything stops at your seat. And probably the hardest thing is to know that every decision, I'm probably going to make 50% of the people happy and 50% mad sometimes. And so
Hmm.
it really is a lonely
Oh,
spot. And so you have to be able to make those decisions and calls, but knowing it's for the betterment of the whole organization, not just your department that you may have been leader of before. So you have to take into a lot more considerations to keep the organization in balance and moving forward. There's never a static point where it's all fixed and moving. It's
No.
always doing this, but you can't let something get too far out of whack.
What's one or two things that you started paying attention to as a CEO that you weren't paying that much attention to when you're the CMO?
Probably a little more on profitability and finances. I didn't have a strong accounting finance degree, which a lot of CEOs come out of CFO, et cetera. So I've had to become more astute at that. But I've been in this industry so long, I've got a pretty good gut feel of the ebbs and flows. I went through 9/11, the 2008 crisis, COVID, all of these forces that contract and expand your presence. Maybe more HR related, working more closely with HR as a cohort rather than another department that handles just these things. I think coming from within the ranks, and to your point, Mario, of just coming from another company, those experiences don't necessarily qualify you to be CEO at the new company. I think you got to go start down being and go on a fast track. Go be the janitor. Go be the person that loads the truck. Go understand the
Yeah.
business.
I mean,
And people really see that. And then when you make a decision, they can't say, oh, he doesn't even know what he's talking about. He doesn't know what I do every day.
well, I always say, especially when Robert and I talk with new CEOs, right, or new executives, the only thing that is the same, if you ever did that job, is the words in your title. That's the
Mm,
only thing that the entire environment is different. People are different. Market is different. Economy, just different time. You were a CEO between
hmm
2018 to 2022. You went through a big pandemic. You kind of, and then you get in at 2023, and now it's a completely different world.
Right.
So nothing is different. You may have some, you know, a playbook here and there, right? You know how to choose your executive team, you know how to talk with them, you know how to talk with the board. As Robert says, what business are we in? What business are we not in? What is my
Yep.
mandate? What is not my mandate? Like
Right.
you maybe know those things, but everything else, night and
Yep.
day,
You,
night and
with all the information, communication, white noise, you have to be more laser focused than ever. As you know, you get off 1 degree, 5 miles down the road, you're off course. I think the other thing too is when you get in the CEO seat, you can get subconsciously so internally focused on policies, procedures, department shifts, people, all this little stuff, and you lose sight of what the most important thing is: your customer, right? You have to maintain revenues and profitability and growth. Otherwise, you're not going to make it very long. And, money covers a lot of sins and mistakes. If the organization is growing and moving forward, I think you get a little bit more gray area on some mistakes, et cetera. But at least you're out trying. At least you're pushing the envelope. And I think, and everybody and we have customers all the way through our org chart. And I'm always saying, focus on your customer. The division manager, focus on your 30 chaplains, focus on your 20 company leaders. We're here to support you. You stay focused out there, and everything, we've got a much better shot at making it.
There's an expression called get outside the building and talk to customers. Is that something
Yep.
that you do?
Yeah, both from a third party neutral survey standpoint, but also in person and talking to people and asking those probing questions. Because at first, oh, you guys are great. We love you. Y'all helped us out of this mess and all that. And so, you need to say, okay, how could we have done better on that? Or what can we do better to serve you? Are you getting the communication and feedback you need from us as a service provider? And then the next one is, what's on the horizon for you? What are some of your new initiatives and things? Is there a way we could come along and help you with some of those, either in communication or, I serve 1,600 other CEOs. Maybe I know somebody in your industry that I could pair you up with that's already done this. And, you just constantly trying to add value.
Before we go too much further, perhaps you could explain what Market Chaplains is about. I'm not sure we established that so
Okay.
far. And how big is it? You just mentioned 1,600 CEOs. How many chaplains do you have? How many CEOs or companies do you service? Whatever
Okay.
you can share about the financial aspects.
Sure. This is our 41st year. We took that military model of workplace chaplaincy, our founder did, and took it to the workplace because employees, usually don't live near their nuclear family anymore. They move around. They're not connected. We're more Harvard Business Review. We're back at work, but we're more isolated and lonely than ever. And I have all kinds of friends on my mobile device and best friends and all that. But when life really hits you, you don't have as many confidants as you might think you do. So our current reach is we serve 1,675 companies that represent 6,200 locations across the U.S., Canada, Alaska, and Puerto Rico. 2,100 chaplains, male, female, ethnically diverse. We speak 41 languages. So they actually go to the sites. They go to the manufacturing shop. They go to the truck terminal. They go to the bank or the auto dealer and make their presence known, get to know people, develop relationships. And that's the personal side of it, unlike an 800 number or just an app. And so what you hope, Robert, is from that personal thing is the service becomes proactive. So before somebody files for bankruptcy, before they decide to break up their family or get into abuse, or before they get addicted, or before they write the suicide note, when life knocks them down and there's a problem, they've got their chaplain that they know is neutral from the company. They're not part of HR. They're not a psychologist. They're not from the church. They're a confidant that can help them. And so if you can give people some hope and coping skills early on, then you got a much better chance of being preventative of bad things happening.
What kind of costs are associated with this? If I'm the CEO of a company, I want to bring you in.
Sure. Yeah, it's minimal. We do a simple PEPM, a price per employee per month. It's based on how many locations, how many people. We're a not for profit, but we have a cost of paying our chaplains their drive time and their mileage. And then it's a turnkey program. We have all the management. We produce KPI reports. They're confidential, of course, without names. And then the chaplains are our employees. So we have to provide continuing education, management, accountability for that. But it's minimal. It's less than the coffee service a month.
How much time does it take to train the chaplain? What's
It,
involved in that?
That's a good question. Well, first off, and I don't want to sound trite, but we don't find people that say, "Hey, I want to try to be a chaplain," and train them to do that. The people we hire and bring on, they already have an average of 20 years of caregiving. They may have seminary degrees. They've got advanced degrees. They've done counseling before. So they come with a wide plethora of already knowing how to listen and care. They're not preachers and therapists, etc. And then we simply train them through 4 modules, in person and virtual. So it's probably a month and a half on the basic training. Then we do a section on coaching, which would be like police ride-alongs after you got out of the academy. We match the new chaplains with seasoned chaplains.
Like shadowing the experienced ones,
Shadowing,
right?
yes, exactly.
A
And then,
non-religious type of thing.
yeah, and then continuing education, because the workplace throws all kinds of things at us, and we have to develop training every month sometimes to give our chaplains, okay, here's the rules of the roads. Here's what you can say and not say. Like this last month, immigration, or this last few months, immigration has a big thing here in the U.S. So we serve a lot of food processing and companies with hourly workers, and they're worried about something, and they ask their chaplain, well, we have to be really neutral and just, care about the person and not make sure we, violate any of the company policies or give some wrong information. So
Are we talking like for an hourly cost of $100 an hour, 200, 300, 500? People always want to know that.
if you're a chaplain,
No, I
you
mean, if
mean,
you're a company buying the
oh,
service.
it's a flat fee per month. So you don't get dinged up and down as it goes on the hourly rate, but it's less than $100. It's not
Okay.
much at all. Yeah.
Okay.
And then the great thing is when we stay in that triage role, companies usually have a lot of benefits that don't get used very often, right? And so we actually first, when we isolate the problem, we actually connect them back to company resources and bolster those usages. Then we can go to community resources if needed. But many times somebody just needs somebody to share a joy with. Sometimes they just want to be heard, not
Yeah.
talked to, or somebody say, well, you should have done that. you know, there's a lot of healing that goes on when you're able to
Yeah.
talk through something and have a chaplain guide you and say, well, what about your part of the situation? What could you have done better? There's a lot of people can get help that way. Besides, you need to do this or that.
Let me just ask you that, and I'll turn it back over to Mario. We all have an advice monster inside us. So, what percentage of the counseling process comes from the advice monster, and from the other side would be the compassionate listener?
Yeah.
What's the balance of that? Or do you tell people not to give advice, or are
No,
they allowed to?
no, you really have to be sensitive and you have to meet people where they're at. And in our role, they have to open the door. We can't run ahead of them. So they
Oh,
need to say, how would you handle the situation? Then
aha.
we're free to share, because we're like, how are you doing today? Fine. No, Robert, how you really doing? Well, my son's daughter's having a test, a surgery, and I'm worried about her. Okay, so we just start a dialogue, right? And I say, well, how could I help you today on that? You say, well, it's out in St. Louis. And I'd say, what if we had one of our female chaplains in St. Louis go check on your daughter in the hospital? Would you like that? God, you can do that? That's awesome. So, yeah, we always let the employee dictate the depth of the situation. And that can go into faith or spirituality. It could just go into common sense. It could go into just, hey, man, this is a tough situation, Robert, but I'm going to be back next Wednesday to check on you. You've got my 24-hour number and you can get a hold of me on the app by FaceTime. But between now and then, when I come back to your office or place of business, know I'm here for you. So at 2 in the morning on Saturday, if you're worried, give me a call.
Excellent.
So let's switch gears just a little bit. One thing that we know that makes or breaks the CEO, apart from his or her relationship with the board, is the executive team, right?
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about the executive team. How did you choose it? You went through the ranks, right? So from the CMO, you went into the CEO position. So it, did you keep everyone that was there? Here's the reason why I'm asking. You got promoted internally, right? So
Yeah.
the dynamic between what were your peers is now a little bit different, right? Because now
Yep.
you become their boss.
Yep. And technically on the org chart, yes, but I never saw myself as their boss. I saw myself as the servant leader to help them be better leaders and win at their role.
But how?
And so
But
that's
okay,
one thing.
sorry.
Yeah,
That's
go ahead.
But how did they see you?
Probably in our situation, the board made some sweeping changes. They had actually removed some people. They had me remove some people on board stuff and we kind of started over a little bit. So that has its own dynamics, right? But I wanted to always tell because a prior CEO said there's no more ladders. When you get to this level, it's here. We're going to hire from outside. I took that away and said, no, I would rather have, there's institutional knowledge, there's all kinds of things. And if somebody has the skills and acumen and EQ to perform at the next level, I want to give them a shot,
And
right?
work ethic. And
And
work
and
ethic.
work ethic. Yeah, they're a known entity, right? You already
Yeah.
know. So I think in mine, there might have been some people that thought, see, I never like set out to be, I want to be the CEO. I want to be the top guy. I just worked hard and got results and did things. And so I got asked. And I think there were some people that were probably like, yeah, that sounds good, but I'm glad Jason's doing that, not me. I ask sometimes on my C-suite when things are tough or there's problems, we'll be here in my office and they sit over there. We got a 6-person table. And I'll say, man, I'm tired. You want to go sit in this chair I'm sitting in now? And they're like, no, you got
No.
it. No, no. But
So,
so how do you build that or when you bring
yeah,
them up or
how do you build that? So imagine I am the first time CEO. I've never been that. I was promoted for the ranks. My board just fired, the C-suites and said, let's start over. So what is the advice that you would give me when hiring my, let's say, CFO, chief marketing, head of sales, head of technology,
yeah.
whatever?
Okay. So here it is. And this is something I've learned, and I don't know if anybody else that has said it. I think that's the biggest problem is people start trying to solve issues or gaps by putting more people in. I think you have to go back to that vision, mission, goals, strategy, objectives, and tactics. Where are we at? Where we're going? Where's the gap? What are the tasks that need to be done to get that achieved?
Oh,
What are the processes to get that done? What software or what other support or contract or other mechanisms are out there I could employ to help us move the deal? Then when I'm at the end of those options, then it's like, okay, I really do need a CFO. I don't just need a controller. And so people throw people at problems, and then all of a sudden that's when you get into an office and there's 80 people around and you're wondering, well, what does Jim really do? He was hired to do really a project, and then now he's just kind of hanging around and nobody knows what he does. So I, that, and not trying to be streamlined or not just trying to not add overhead, which once you add C-level and EVPs, that's big overhead. Your break even
yeah,
point
not they don't
runs
get
up,
cheap.
right? Yeah. I mean, so, if you go through that process and then make sure your job description is up to date, make sure the pay bands are up to date, make sure expectations, and then you got to put it out to everybody, outside and inside, and you go through the interview process. And it's kind of like the U.S. hockey team that won the gold medal. Sometimes it's not always the best shining star candidate. It's the one that's going to work with the team the best. And so that's part of that culture thing that starts at the top with the CEO.
Yeah. Robert and I spent an enormous amount of time talking, especially big companies, what's happening with Starbucks, what's happening in Nike, and all of that. And one of the questions I really, really wanted to ask you, and you hinted, and I remember that you said that, so I said, oh, I'm going to come back to this later.
All
You
right.
said, I have no financial background, right? So my question to you is, if you do not look at the financials, how do you know the company's doing
That's
really
a good
well?
question. I don't have formal training. I know enough to look at a
Yeah,
balance sheet
yeah,
and
yeah.
profit.
But if you don't look at it, so how do you know, oh, we are doing really okay?
If you can make payroll and you have money left over at the end of the month, is a non-problem. So honestly, we went through some controllers and things during the last year and a half, and we went to a conversion to Workday ERP system for both HR and finance. And so there's a lot of this. I went back to the basics. We have these checks and ACHs and revenue coming in, April 1. I have this payroll and these expenses April 2 through April 29. April 30th, we're still solvent, right? Sometimes you got to go back to the simple basics. And I know that's not good on forecasting, and you could really be in a negative trend and not know it. But when you're in kind of when you're storming and reforming things, it's blocking and tackling. Are we being judicious? Are we
Yeah, basics.
spending money wisely? And are we growing? Are we
Yeah.
still trying to grow?
I've got a couple of questions to ask you. When I was looking over your LinkedIn profile, your website, it seemed that the people who are your customers, the people who are in pain, let's say, seem to highly value your service. And so did their bosses, CEOs, managers, whatever. And it was impressive to learn that. And I started thinking about, wow, they have 1,600 CEOs that they work for.
But 423,000 employees we serve.
Okay,
1,000.
so let me step back a minute. So I wrote a book called Masterful Coaching,
Okay.
and the subtitle of the book is "Become the Leader Your Business Needs While Realizing an Impossible Future and Transforming People's Lives," something like that.
Yeah.
So I found that the act of setting an impossible goal can be very powerful, and it's one of the fastest way to scale a business. So when I looked at your website, I said, "Well, they have a very good. I think they call it a product market fit."
Yeah.
And so I started thinking, I can see it's working for the employee, it's working for the CEO. I don't like the word employee really, but the person.
The,
So I started thinking about what would it take to scale this business 10x? That's
mm-hmm.
an impossible goal. Why don't they have 160,000 CEOs
Co-
that they're working for.
companies.
You have the product market fit. You seem to have the economics and the marketing sorted out.
Yep.
So, what's your reaction to that? I said, hey, they should scale this. They should set and reach an impossible goal
Yeah.
of, I shouldn't say should, but I could see it happening of 160,000
Yeah.
CEOs and
So,
4
so
million
far
employees.
the far-reaching vision I put in last year is for every employee in America to have access to a chaplain.
Okay.
Now, that may not be us. That's why in 3 weeks I'm going to go to Springfield, and I've got 13 other, they're smaller chaplain provider organizations, because it's going to take all of us to do that. To answer your question, I've got well, there's three customers: the CEOs and the HR leaders that hire us, and then obviously our chaplains, and then the employees, the people we serve. But we're only as good as our worst performing chaplain.
Yeah.
So I,
Yeah.
you could go out and get and we have some 30 and 40,000 employee client companies, but they're in 200 locations. You got to have A+ chaplains in every one location.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's the hardest part, is getting people that are qualified, that are called, that are trainable, that, because it's not a good job some days when you're going around seeing 100, 110 people. They're not all huggy, kissy, all that. They're like in deep depression. They're thinking of suicide. Their wife left them. Their mom is dying in hospice care. It's a heavy job.
Supply, your limit to growth is the number of chaplains
Yeah,
that you can produce.
correct. Now, coming from marketing at day one, I said, look, guys, marketing is not from the marketing and sales department. A+ service is our best salesperson, because that provides your referrals, your sustainability, your retention of your clients. So we hone in on A+ service, A+ chaplains, and delivering A+ service. Yeah, we do some marketing things. And the great thing now is we have the capacity to grow. We're in 2,100 cities. 20 years ago, if we got a new client in Western Colorado, we'd have to go find two or three chaplains to serve them. Well, now we more than likely 90% of the time have it. So we are ramping up, and we're growing 10, 12% a year, but you got to have the systems to sustain that. So
Well,
we
let
just
me
did
push
the
you
last,
on that a little bit. Let me play the
yeah.
role of Jerry Jones. You're a Dallas
All
fan
right.
or Bill Belichick, and say, okay, if I was to ask you to, well, conversation for possibility, meaning that you don't have to commit yourself. What would be an impossible growth goal for your organization for 2 to 3 years? And
Uh,
then I'm going to ask you another one. What would be an impossible growth goal for 60 days?
Okay, so the 2 to 3 years, I wouldn't want to say we could double in 2 to 3 years. I think we'll double in 6 to 7 years. 60 days,
Well,
you
the
know,
reason I said 2 or 3 years because 6 to 7 years, 10 years, it's hard to get any urgency on that.
right.
If I say you got 1 year
Yeah.
or 6 months or 60 days, what would be your? If I said now you've got 20 seconds to set and reach an impossible goal. What would
Yeah.
you?
Well, a growth for us can come with one company with 70,000 employees or 20 companies with 400 employees. So,
Okay.
and we get the gamut. So I measure number of people. But if we were to try to say in 60 days to get 20,000 employees would be a challenge, but all it takes is some of the big companies I can name that have been in the pipeline. We haven't talked to in a year, and they say, hey, we had 2 suicides, morale's at an all-time low. We should have put you guys in, start at these 5 plants, and it equals 20,000 employees. That happens all the time. But we're constantly filling the pipeline, the marketing side, and filling the pipeline. And because our sales cycle is 2 years, this isn't something,
Oh,
see, people don't have to have.
Ah,
See,
yeah.
so there's the deal. It's not like fuel or
It's not
raw material.
mandatory. It's not mandatory
Correct.
by law, right? And
No,
it's not seen. Oh, unfortunately, I would say mental health not seen as essential in
right.
especially in the workplace. So, Jason, let me maybe ask you the same question Robert asked you, but just in a different way. If your board would come and say, "Hey, how can we double in the next year or in next 2 years? Let's say your sales cycle is 2 years, so let's say double in as a CEO, because this happens more often than not with CEOs, right? What then becomes your thought process? What becomes your, okay, first, I think what you would do is you would put down your glasses and say, oh my God, this effing board. All right. But then reality hits in. Okay, so how do I make it happen? So the question really isn't can you do it or should you do it or do you want to do it? Question is how do I change the way I think about my business? That's the root of Robert's
Yep.
question, right? So
Yep. And that's why some people have asked me it's unusual for the CMO to go to the CEO. But if you think of IBM, their leaders came out of the sales department. So I love these questions. If the board came and said, we've got a check and what do you want to do? I can answer that. It's kind of like nonprofits that I'm around a lot. I always ask them, they say, well, we want to do this and that, or we're thinking that. I said, okay, if I gave you $1 million check, how would you spend it? They go, I don't know. They don't have any plan, right? That would excite me. And I think I could rattle off in 10 minutes, probably a pretty good little plan on how to try to go and get it.
Well, let me come back, and Mario actually did pick up on my thoughts. There's a form of strategic planning called you set an impossible goal, you
BHAG.
create a strategy, a general strategy to reach it, but then you have the nut to crack.
Yep.
In this case, the obstacle, which is training more chaplains. This business is a business worthy of doubling, worthy of 10xing. What are your thoughts on how you could 10x the number of chaplains that you had? And we say
Yep.
10x is easier than 2x
Yep.
because it forces you to think outside the box.
Well, we've shifted some of our models of how we construct the teams where we don't need as many chaplains. So we started getting too many and trying to be too many things to too many people, and it's not necessary. So understanding that, we're pushing our current customers for referrals because they're like, oh, yeah, it's great. Yeah, let me introduce you to Bill. He's a counter of mine in California. The marketing team is great. We know enough on the digital side and everything else.
I'm talking about chaplain training. That seems to be the
Okay, let me back that up. Before we can train them, we got to find them. So chaplain recruiting. Chaplain recruiting would be the number one obstacle right now to go out and find a Portuguese speaking chaplain in Omaha, Nebraska to serve 60 employees at a
That's
location.
interesting.
And we do that. I mean, yeah, so there's the hidden obstacle. I do leverage our current chaplains with incentives. We post a list of our critical needs because a current chaplain is going to know what works, right? So we don't have to go through a lot of fluff of a lot of leads or prospects or candidates. Usually when people come to us, they're within the margin of error to more than likely sign on with us.
Mario, I have another question. Just before we end, I have a question I want to ask.
sure.
I wrote this book called Masterful Coaching. At the time, there were no people that you would call professional coaches, personal coaches. It didn't exist. My goal was to create a movement that would disrupt traditional leadership development, traditional business consulting, and traditional coaching and counseling. And for me, counseling was kind of like the enemy because traditional coaching was just counseling. It was very similar to what you're calling the chaplain service. But I see there's a role for counseling or for someone having a chaplain that counsels them. What we do at Masterful Coaching is the other side of it, the
Yeah.
coaching side. And I believe that coaching, whether it's in the Dallas Cowboys or the Dallas Mavericks or whoever, takes place in the domain of realizing an impossible dream like winning a Super Bowl, winning an accomplishment, specifically accomplishment. The difference between coaching and counseling is that coaching takes place in the domain of
Yeah.
accomplishment. Have you ever considered having a joint venture with people doing coaching for results as opposed to counseling for well-being?
Personal well-being. We have some informal strategic alliances like that with like Pinnacle Forum, C12, Convene, others, where many of those CEO peer groups, many of those leaders are also trained and certified coaches. Um, as far as a personal coach to an employee or person on the front lines, many of them need, especially if they're in that first level management roll up, there's a big gap in the mid management, lower and mid management coaching, I believe, because people get elevated because they did good work and nobody teaches them how to manage and lead, right?
CEO peer groups is not what I would call coaching.
No.
I
But some
remember
of
one
the
time, 10 or 15 years ago, they brought me into Shell,
Texaco.
Texaco, and I was down there in Houston or someplace.
Mm-hmm.
And I was leading the seminar. I was saying, why don't you guys talk to each other? It was a leadership program of some kind. And then they said, hey, Robert, we can always talk to each other. We want to hear what you have to say. So I think this peer group stuff is, that's a good discussion group, but it's actually on a scale of 1 to 10, about a 3 on the, you want to sit with Bill Belichick or you want to be in a discussion of peer group, team coaching. Maybe both are valid.
Well, those chairs are typically higher up, right?
Yeah.
They've done $100 million business, and now they're leading the peer group of others. But my point was, on some of those organizations, those chairs also do coaching and can come to the person's business and help some of their leadership team. I think the gap is on those employees that get into their first management supervisory role,
Oh,
and they don't have some more one-on-one personal coaching. They've never had to work with a rebellious employee or set goals and things. So
I was thinking that could be a way for you to increase your dollar volume. Cash flow.
within a current client, always adding more value added
You've got
services.
1,600 CEOs. I don't know if money is a driver for you, but to do more on the coaching side would be an obvious way to
Yeah.
maybe double, triple, or 10x your revenue.
Yeah, I've got one little value add. So if we see on the charts that the employees are really dealing with stress, we have 30-minute lunch and learn deals that employees can come to on how to deal with stress. It's simple stuff, but then there needs to be that off ramp and onboard personal coach. And I think leaders, if they want to develop from within, I want to invest in this person because I see their potential to be up in the executive suite one day. So why would I want to let them flounder and go somewhere else?
So you're talking about the development, so leadership development
Yeah.
at all levels.
Yeah. If we did know other organizations that were nationwide, we can put that into our resource list for our people. And when they run into that, they say, hey, have you ever considered having a personal coach with this? Or we talk to the company about it, and then we just hand it off. I don't want to envelop it into our service offerings per se. It's too hard to do what we do as it is.
Okay.
Yeah. But I agree with you. Very good.
Jason, thank you so much for joining us today. I do hope you had a nice conversation with me and Robert. I
did.
hope this was productive, I would say.
Yeah. You guys gave me some challenges. I hope some of the things I said were valuable to your audience. Do you think?
Oh, they were indeed. They were indeed.
Okay, good.
It is most of the time, especially big companies, they just go out and find a CEO. Being promoted from within has its own challenges, right? Simply because you were in the company for a long time, and there is maybe sometimes the lack of, I don't want to say fresh perspective, but outsider coming in has its own benefits. But again, so does the person who has a lot of content and knowing that the market, the organization, and the issues in the industry.
Right.
So thank you so much, Robert. Insightful as always. And
you,
for everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, goodbye. Signing off. Ciao.